and I think we're live, streaming from Malaysia at the moment. Good evening, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be. My name is Raymond. You might remember me from some of the previous conversations I hosted for the program. I work as senior writer for Buddhist Global. I've been a religion journalist for over 10 years. But tonight's stream and hopefully future streams will be trying something different. I'll be interviewing one-on-one a special guest, someone with a specific focus, a specific specialty, and lovely people who have a lot of insights to offer. And thematically, we will be quite relaxed, and basically we'll be covering a very, very wide range of subjects spanning the Buddhist world. So stay tuned for next week's surprise topic. Tonight, we are going to cover, at least for initially, like a topic very close to my heart, Buddhist studies. We will be examining it kind of like in a broad context, not just the subjects, which there are too many to cover in a single stream, even one that's like 1.5 hours, 2 hours, but Buddhist studies as a methodology, as an academic discipline, as like, something that people get degrees for, something that is taught in universities around the world. And so it's my absolute delight to welcome someone who is an absolute expert and eminently qualified to talk about Buddhist studies. And his name is Dr. Mattia Salvini. He and I actually share a indirect bond. I noticed that he did his PhD from at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, although they don't use that term very much anymore. While I was also a former student of Buddhist studies at SOAS as well. And so he's been very busy with a wide range of projects on Buddhist studies. And it's my delight to welcome him for tonight's live stream conversation. Mattia, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Raymond. Nice to see you. And yes, somehow we're both from SOAS. It's true.
Yeah, go on.
Like other friends too, it seems SOAS is a meeting point of many different people.
You can say that again. That must have been some time ago. If I say the word SOAS, does it bring back does it bring back memories, nostalgia, kind of like?
No, nostalgia, no.
No, we're going right into it.
Definitely not. No, it brings up memory of cold and damp. Yes, cold and damp. That's the first thing that comes to mind. SOAS. The first thing that comes to my mind when SOAS is mentioned is actually my friends Daud and Sugra, because it is thanks to Daud. Daud Ali is a historian who now is not at SOAS. He's in the United States, but he's the person who convinced me to try and join SOAS and who made it possible. And he and his then wife Sugra were my hosts. I spent 1 year with them, and that is what made it possible for me to study at SOAS, which I was not necessarily expecting to do at that point in time. because I was studying in India and in a much more traditional setting. And so this became a completely different trajectory in a way, but
Yes.
one would allow it to be more sustainable, basically.
Right. Like the you raise a very important point. So just for those who don't know, SOAS, or the School of Oriental and African Studies, is a constituent college of the University of London. So it's an institution, tertiary institution based in London, which traditionally has been a fairly popular go-to place for Buddhist study scholars. Although, yeah, like I think memory-wise, like we've all got our different recollections of that place and our experiences there. And you raised a very important point about the contrast between a more traditional, like Buddhist education and Buddhist studies education based in the West, right? So, like, I think a lot of people, even today, get that a little bit confused. Like, I like to say that Buddhist studies should be seen as like an academic discipline, that was kind of like founded in the 19th century. It draws on certain inspirations from like biblical criticism and like other methodologies found from drawn from Western universities. Like, what was your kind of like experience contrasting your BA and then your PhD back in London?
Well, for me, it was very difficult in the beginning because I had gone to study in India, and I did my Sanskrit BA and MA in a college, which is a modern institution,
Yeah.
but which was set up so as to respect traditional modes of learning. And that is really what I was interested into.
Yeah.
I studied Buddhist texts primarily at the time privately by going to my teacher, Professor Ram Shankar Tripathi, in Sarnath.
Yeah.
And also I learned from my Tibetan teachers. So my approach was entirely traditional, and I had specifically gone there because that's what I wanted. I had
Yes.
studied philosophy for a little while in Florence,
Yeah.
but
In Florence. Yeah.
my impression was not, I wasn't very inspired, and also the philosophy they offered was not something that really interested me that much. So when it came to SOAS, it was more like I was stuck. I was thinking, now what do I do exactly?
Yeah.
And uh, is there any advantage in going and studying in a more academic, in the traditional sense, although not a traditional institution?
Yeah.
Is it going to be useful in any way?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
largely talking with several friends, but especially Doubt, that convinced me that actually not all academics are evil, because that was a little bit my this,
Yeah.
and that I could go there and learn something
Yeah.
in terms of, also of communicating with a wider world, because sometimes when we are in a more traditional environment, we don't have a window to, especially at that time when there was not that much on the internet, there was not that window to a wider world. And so there's a risk to become unable to communicate with this wider world.
Yeah.
So in that respect, I had some positive expectation. And also what I was told was that the real wealth of SOAS is the student body.
Right.
And
Yes.
I felt that that was true. SOAS had, I think still has, probably a very diverse student body. And although I didn't really participate that much in student life due to my own kind of predispositions, but nevertheless, it's a very positive environment from that perspective, and they learn from that as well.
Yeah.
So there was still a little bit of difficulty, because if at all ever I'll be a scholar,
Yeah.
I'm a traditional scholar, basically.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
by training, by conviction, however you want to put it.
Yeah.
And I try to fit this mentality, if you wish, in a modern academic setting, both in terms of
I see.
teaching or publication, etc. But my aspiration, if at all, I'm not actually very interested in being a scholar, but if at all I have to be a scholar, it should be a traditional scholar. That is what really interests me. I don't feel so much, how can I put it? I don't feel so much predisposition towards what would normally be considered traditional academic research or publication, etc. It might sound paradoxical because I do it, but my effort has always been to try to introduce as much as possible of traditional concerns, traditional modes of teaching, writing, and learning in a modern academic setting.
Yes.
That is really what, just out of necessity, basically, because of my own situation.
Yes. And I think, to your point, in regard to sort of feeling like this academic environment was quite ambivalent. You had ambivalent feelings towards it, because I think the academic professionals that they were training were not the model that you had initially sort of aspired to be. I did notice during my time at SOAS, which was 2010 to 2011, like there are a decent amount of sort of like monastics, right, and self-proclaimed lay Buddhists who go to study Buddhist studies. I kind of consider myself being one of them, although I did not go into higher, what do you call it, like a postgraduate program, like a PhD. I certainly wanted to be equipped, with a postgraduate degree, to be able to do the work that I wanted to do for the Dharma. And I think, I think a lot of people go in there, with that nuanced position. It's like, oh, I do recognize the value of like a rigorous sort of training in the methodologies, but I'm doing it as an insider. I'm doing it with like maybe a higher degree of empathy than the people who are teaching it, because I think 100% of the scholars at SOAS are not Buddhist, right? So, would you agree with that assessment, or is there something missing?
Well, there's two things that I would, in order to describe my own experience, I would phrase a little bit differently. One is empathy. Now, I don't think I would describe it in that way. I would rather describe it as reverence.
Reverence, right?
Which is something more. And this is an attitude which doesn't even have to do with Buddhist texts themselves.
Yeah.
This is something that I would afford to anything I'm studying. And that is actually also the way we were taught when I was learning Sanskrit in Vivekananda College, because we would be taught texts from different traditions, and very often my own teachers were not necessarily followers of that particular tradition, but the idea was always, while you're learning a certain text, you have to approach it with great reverence, And before you decide to dismantle its positions, you have to try to understand it,
Yeah.
which requires a type of personal investment which is beyond just empathy. Now, I should point out, actually, interestingly, that something very similar existed when I was studying philosophy in Italy. And this is in a modern university setting. But the idea was that if you think that you're going to study Hegel,
Yeah.
it's the first time you read Hegel, and if you think that you can already tell me all the shortcomings of Hegelian philosophy, you're probably foolish, because
Yeah.
it takes many years to absorb such a difficult thinker. Now, the tendency in the Anglo-Saxon system, which has become basically the norm, is that you start from an antagonistic relationship with what you study. You should start on guard, like you're reading someone who's trying to cheat you, basically, and your manner of being a critical thinker is to point out where you've been cheated by those authors. That is more or less the feeling that I got from a number of more or less explicit clues that appear in the wordings of examination papers, in the way you present hypotheses with
Yeah.
a degree of confidence by no means warranted by the
Exactly.
evidence
Yeah.
you produce. And so that's where the second word I wanted to change is rigor, because I think that the contemporary academic study of Buddhism is everything but. I think that actually the vast majority of what is published there's a lot of speculation. It's presented as being scientific, but actually it is not based, of course, on repeated experimentation in any possible way.
No,
It
it's
doesn't
not. Yeah.
in any possible way explicate the parameters of the interpretation of the data. Everyone does whatever you want, as long as you follow a certain format that gives a sense of being structured.
Yeah.
That is enough for something to pass as a scientific publication. And this word science is just a marker of prestige. It doesn't
Yes.
really indicate any specific method. It just means you were able to produce something in a certain format that is acceptable to an academic publisher,
Yes.
and that gives you sufficient prestige for
Yeah.
what you're producing to be called science. This doesn't mean that you have done anything accurate, doesn't mean that
Yeah.
you have done any real research. It doesn't mean that it is much reliable. So I feel that the rigor that you were mentioning is very much hit and miss. There are, of course, really honest, intellectually honest, hardworking scholars who produce things projecting a realistic level of confidence in their hypotheses and presenting them as hypotheses.
Yeah.
But not everyone believes in being cautious in one's writing. And so you get a lot that comes to have tremendous leverage on the Buddhist tradition too, and which actually is based almost on nothing. So
Right.
this, I think, that's why when it comes to rigor, I was not thinking I'm going to a place of rigor. I had no expectation regarding that,
Yeah.
because when it comes to rigor, you could say that some parts of traditional learning are more rigorous.
Yes. Yes.
So, and I found that yes, it's hit and miss. Of course, one can say it's hit and miss also in traditional circles, but to necessarily associate anything that comes out of modern academia with things being scientific, rigorous, well reviewed is unrealistic. So this is something that I think one should be aware of.
It's almost like a kind of branding thing, isn't it? Like,
Yeah,
as you said, it has, like modern Buddhist studies, the methodology has nothing to do with the scientific method, right? But it is seen as scientific because there is an air of sophistication and sort of like a specific adherence to a kind of antagonistic methodology that can be projected by the university professors and like kind of like the administrators and so on, as kind of like a scientific, as something that has arrogated to itself the right to sort of like order the hierarchy of Buddhist understanding in the Buddhist world, which can affect Buddhists themselves.
it does.
Yeah, and so like I mean, we could continue going down this route. Like, so for example, while you were describing all these caveats with the words I used, empathy and rigor, right? So I really appreciate you sort of drawing out some of the problems with those words. We could talk about, like, for example, you might be aware of like Bhikkhu Analayo, who's a German, like, who's a
Yes.
German scholar. Like for example, I haven't read enough of his work, but as far as I know, he is an ordained monk, and he's also sort of done a lot of like research and philology and sort of like that kind of thing. Like, I don't know if that might be some sort of a model that you have observed that could work in this sort of modern setting. But I also have one more sort of route of discussion, which you mentioned, the Anglo-Saxon method, right? Which you say is sort of like kind of, it starts from a point of antagonism, right? And so in Buddhist studies, like globally, you've had a lot of experience. As far as I understand, it's not just the Anglo school of Buddhist studies, right? You also have, as I understand, the German school of Buddhology, and like in Japan they have their own thing going on, and even in Italy, we have some very eminent names in Buddhist studies. Like, are there variations of this academic culture?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it depends from person to person as well. Like, I know academics that do not have this antagonistic attitude at all, at all. And it even doesn't depend on whether they are Buddhist practitioners or not. In fact, sometimes it's those who are very open about being Buddhist practitioners who end up having overcritical attitudes towards the Buddhist sources. Overcritical, I do not mean applying critical thinking in the sense of applying thought and reflection. I mean this slightly antagonistic and suspicious way of relating to the sources. So, on the other hand, you find scholars who are absolutely away from the Buddhist tradition, who nevertheless do not feel the need to be very gratuitously negative about it. They don't have to prove themselves by doing that. Now, I would generally refrain to, how to put it, discuss examples of specific people, especially because now if we discuss Bhikkhu Analayo and they say something, he's not here to respond. And so I don't think it's an ideal situation.
No worries. Yeah, that's completely fine. I understand that. No worries at all.
But one that I would like to mention as an example, who I think is an interesting example, and he did one thing that I felt was very significant, more maybe than some really realize, is Professor Gombrich.
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
Professor Gombrich to me is extremely interesting because he explained why he feels what he's doing is scientific. So, and he has a good basis to do that. His mentor was Karl Popper. So his idea is that he used Popperian ideas of what science is and transferred them onto the humanities and specifically onto Buddhist studies. So he formed his hypothesis on the basis of this. Now, the point is, I might not really agree exactly that that constitutes science, but I appreciate that someone takes the pains of explaining what he's doing so that I can see very clearly where my differences are, like where my difference in terms of my understanding of how we acquire reliable knowledge is, for me, is very clear when I read Professor Gombrich. And this I felt was something that's very good in a way, very, very good to do that. I know exactly where we're going to disagree, and I don't have a problem with it. I also don't get surprised that he will bring forth hypotheses that, for me, are not very plausible or convincing. So this is one example of course, I'm not talking here of an example of a practitioner and modern academic, because he explicitly says he's not a practitioner.
He's not a Buddhist, exactly.
Precisely because Buddhism doesn't fit with science, actually, interestingly. So, which I find is very honest. I really appreciate that position.
We can admire that, absolutely.
I think that kind of clarity is really very, very admirable. So, how exactly does one fit these two things together? I think it's important not to run towards schizophrenia, because it is quite easy to write and read in a certain mode, and then when it comes to one's personal practice, one is running in the opposite direction, because well, maybe I'm being I'm not too optimistic, but I would say quite a bit of Buddhist studies literature doesn't have that sense of reverence towards the text or the author of the text. On the contrary, the tendency to say, well, let's look at who these people really were, which means they were bad. That's
so okay. Anyway, go on. We'll talk about
So, of course, this is more of a problem than we might think if one is genuinely trying to be a Buddhist practitioner, because Shraddha, faith in the Buddhist context, doesn't come at a very small price. So one needs to have a good degree of understanding and experience to have a really unshakable type of conviction in the Buddhist teachings, and to be constantly exposed to literature which does its best to show that Buddhism is nothing great, that the Buddhist masters were ordinary people and possibly worse than average, and that, of course, Buddhism has nothing to do with the nature of reality. Like, all of this is not going to be completely neutral to one's mind stream, in my opinion. It is going to affect one. I used to get upset, honestly. I used to feel like, why are we writing in this manner? I would not write in this manner about a living person. And interestingly, they don't do it. As long as an author is alive, you cannot write something very negatively. The moment they pass away, it's fair play. You can just do whatever you want. I don't think that is a very good principle. Accusing people of being hypocritical, dishonest, etc., when they can't respond to me, it doesn't look like science. It looks like
Yeah.
cowardice.
Cowardice. And I really do question the intentions, like, because it's certainly one thing if you come across like textual discrepancies or errors, like in, like the Gandhari, folios, and then you're like, oh, scribes at one point might have misspelled this translation from, Prakrit to Sanskrit, whatever, right? But like as you're saying, we have a whole contingent of people who assume bad faith on part of the text. They are assuming that the texts themselves were authored by, as you said, like people with, quite frankly, malicious kind of like intent. And I do wonder, like, I'm not casting accusations, but I do wonder as to what kind of mindset you have to find yourself in, to kind of like put yourself in this career. This must have been very hard work, all these years of academic study, so that you're in a position to kind of like start throwing punches like that. That's a little troubling for me.
Yes.
What do you think?
I think actually there's probably a variety of situations, but what happens sometimes is that one starts as a practitioner and quickly turns into a businessman. So somebody might get into an academic setting thinking that I'm going to be a practitioner scholar, but then they will really decide to, as much as possible, just not resist the pressure to prove themselves as distant from what they're studying. So
Right.
to prove that they are critical and objective. They will not resist that pressure, and they might even overdo it in order to fit within the system, thinking that this will make them fit within that system. But this, I doubt, has no effect on one's mind. I think this is it's difficult to do that all the time and expect that it's not going to affect how one genuinely feels towards the Buddhist tradition and the three jewels, etc., etc. The other point is, in some circles, there's also kind of a cult of intelligence. So if you're doing something which is a little bit obscure, like some language which is regarded as difficult, and you're able to read it well, and you can show that you're very smart in reading certain things and understanding some things, then that itself is something that is enjoyable in its own right. So this actually is better because it doesn't go to that extreme usually of really being completely antagonistic, because it recognizes that there is also intelligence in what you're reading, even though you might not believe in it, but you appreciate the great intelligence.
You're just a snob, but you have no ill will to the actual text itself, right? You just like looking at your paper in the prestigious journal. That's all.
Something like that. Or you just generally enjoy very high levels of intelligence and mental refinement for its own sake. And that is still, it's not that bad. I mean, that is, so there's a gamut of possible positions in that respect. And so we have to be also mindful that the category academic is just an abstract category, and then you're meeting people which have different lives, interests, and characters. So each of them is going to have their own problem, if you wish, or their own perspective on what they do. And it might resonate more or less with someone who is more of a Buddhist practitioner in a traditional way. Now, the way I try to put it, although I know the term is sometimes misunderstood in its more political connotation, is to decolonize one's mind.
Right, decolonize one's mind,
Now, this is a term which was invented by an African author, and that was more in a political context, but the politics of language in Africa. How Africans were made to feel that African languages should be somewhat at the periphery of one's own mind, and your center is English, and
Right.
you go there from that center. So my point is, this is really what we don't want if we are convinced of Buddhist thought as being our center. It should remain that. We should not, the moment we write academically or teach academically, take up another center and look at Buddhism from that center. Because
linguistically, yeah.
And not just linguistically, I mean, in terms of what we believe has the greatest epistemic power.
Right.
So we shouldn't look, let's say, if you're convinced that Buddhism is your thing, you don't need to then take up analytical philosophy and look at Buddhism from that and write from that perspective, as if you need to explain it from this other perspective, meaning this is the stronger means to understanding something and we're going to use it to make sense of this. No, I use Buddhism to make sense of everything.
Yes.
Including Buddhism. So
Yes.
that should remain the center. But this is what one is encouraged not to do. The way it is put is that, of course, this is a way to maintain what you described as academic distance and therefore objectivity, but it's not. It just means that what you are emotionally close to is something else, and you're not even always disclosing it. So this is not a case of objectivity, it's just a case of choosing something else, sometimes arbitrarily, because very often these choices are not a matter of very explicit rational argumentation. There's just this idea that academia is rigorous, that's what we put at our center, and then we look at Buddhism. This way we will come up with a more realistic and frank assessment of what Buddhism really is. Now, if someone is convinced of that, they should not be Buddhist practitioners in the first place, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they have discarded the possibility that Buddhism is the means to actually get in touch with the nature of reality. So they have already somewhat they don't think that Buddhism has much to do with truth. They need something else, a completely different set of instruments that they believe are true.
Yeah.
This is an important point in order to assess Buddhism. So I think this is not a situation that one should feel obliged to conform to. So if somebody is an academic and is convinced of the Buddhist tradition, they just can use that.
Yeah.
Just like if somebody is a Heideggerian, let's say, or a Hegelian, they don't need to disavow that when they're studying Heidegger or Hegel. Or we could give plenty of other examples.
So you've pointed out this potentially huge blind spot or weakness within the Buddhist studies sort of institution as we understand it. Like as you said, if you were a sincere Buddhist practitioner, you would use Buddhism to look at everything in life, right? Like you would understand everything on Buddhism's terms. And, you know, even if you would at the very least try to understand Buddhism on Buddhism's terms. And so there's this, now you're looking at the problem was where the academics, not all of them, but there are some, and some of them are quite influential. They are looking at Buddhism based on a different set of principles and a priori kind of like concepts and ideas and assumptions and things like that. And yeah, like I just wonder, how, this is a major problem, especially for, those of us who see the value in like a Buddhist studies environment. but like we see these, this outright disrespect and kind of like dismissal of the Buddhist tradition itself within the subject taught. What impact did that have on you when you encountered that during your studies and throughout your teaching career?
Not that much, because
Right.
in my case personally, I did not have any kind of tendency to regard something modern, something which comes from modern Europe or North America, as being a very attractive way of thinking about reality.
Right.
I'm not even using the word Western, because there are European thinkers from, I don't know, the 15th century, which I would have held in high regard.
Yeah.
But it's the modern trend that for me was completely alienating. And therefore, I just continued on my own intellectual path. And the point is, there is a space to do that. There is actually, if somebody really wants to try to find areas of even modern academic studies which somewhat resonate with the traditional concerns, it can be done.
Yeah.
It is quite possible, but I feel it is the scholar practitioners themselves who
Yeah.
quite often do not want to do that very much.
Yeah.
So it's as long as there is a space for everyone, I think it is not a big issue.
Yeah.
Like, I have no problem with the fact that somebody might not really have that level of commitment to the Buddhist tradition, but still might want to study it for one reason or another. I think
Yeah.
that is legitimate, and I have no problem with that. The difficulty is that modern universities, of course, were not born in a Buddhist environment, were not set up to privilege the type of methods that grew in Buddhist or closely related traditions. And therefore, someone who wants to emphasize that is immediately at a natural disadvantage.
Yeah.
It's even the architecture. Sometimes I point this out to the students, because there's a Japanese novelist who wrote a book called In Praise of Shadows, which is about how Japan was moving away from traditional architecture,
Yes.
and how more modern forms of architecture were changing one's own life experience. Well, this is also true of the rooms wherein we studied. It's interesting that we use chairs and desks. That is
Absolutely. Yeah, that is really an important point. Yeah.
why don't we sit on the ground, for example, which could be very well done in
Yeah.
many places without any problem whatsoever. In some places
Yeah.
it's done. In Ranjung they do it,
Yeah.
but you can see that even the physical structure of a university in the way we have it now, its administrative divisions, the divisions in terms of subjects, etc. All of this comes from a tradition which is quite different from the Buddhist tradition.
Yes.
And it means we have to squeeze it in somehow. But unless we make a very conscious effort to increase the Buddhist element, it just doesn't happen on its own. The tendency is the opposite. I mean, this is a broader concern, because the tendency in general is that the humanities are downplayed in universities worldwide, I think.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
So this is affecting Buddhist studies as well, even in terms of the possible directions it's going to take.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but I think that within the various possible academic subdivisions of modern universities, Buddhism is most closely associated with the humanities, most definitely not the hard sciences.
Yeah.
In that case, we are also affected by this, and we are in a kind of desperate situation because there is not that much support in terms of public support for Buddhist studies. So let alone all the problems of academics maybe not always being rigorous and maybe being very cynical about their subject matter. But then there is also no interest in the humanities, there's no support for Buddhist studies. Now, the question I have in respect to this is, aren't these two things related? Because to some extent, if all the books I'm going to produce are books wherein I gratuitously am going to write that this and that Buddhist master, certainly they had bad intention. No proof of that, because you cannot really.
You can't you can only speculate.
But people do it. So that's all I'm going to produce. Then is it possible that at some point the public find it a bit alienating and not that interesting?
That is a really good point. It's like you're digging your own grave in a sense. You're not fighting for your own corner, right? Like, as you said, like humanities are in decline worldwide. If you look at it from the macros perspective, like for example, my closest experience is Australia and the UK, where successive governments have launched, quite frankly, what I see as an ideological battle against the humanities. And never mind the fact that at least at my old university in Australia, the employment rate for arts, that's what they call it in Australia, arts graduates, was as high as those of like in science, right? I think it was even 1% higher. But that doesn't matter because those are not the professions that the government wants to emphasize. So, but in any case, so it's purely ideological. And we are not helped by the fact that there is almost like we are almost apologizing for our own presence in the academy, and we try to say, oh yeah, I'm part of the cool group, don't worry, because I also self-criticize, I'm also a skeptic, I'm also good at undermining my own my own team, so to speak. But as you said, that has the unintended side effect of like the wider public going, well, then what good are you? Like, what are you, what are you offering us, really?
Well, and why are you studying these guys if you despise them so much? Why are you studying this if they have no connection to reality? Like, why exactly engage in this if you think that it is so bad? And if you're going to spend hundreds of pages just to prove it, you're just proving us that it's not worth engaging with it. So why should we still fund your faculty? So this, I think, is maybe an unintended effect indeed. But exactly what is the root of this type of phenomenon, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's something that would require maybe the civilizational disaster. I don't know. It is quite difficult why it happens. But that is to say, okay, we want to do something for Buddhist studies. Why don't we present why it is worth engaging with the Buddhist texts? Why it is worth, and I'm using specifically the example of text because I think that is the best bet in terms of connection also with traditional type of concerns with Buddhism.
Yeah.
So why don't we focus on the content? Like even at SOAS, the MA used to be all history of this, history of that. And students who took the MA sometimes could get an MA in Buddhist studies with very foggy ideas about basic points of Buddhist philosophy.
Right.
Which is so important for the Buddhist tradition. If you undergo Buddhist education, you should study those teachings which tell you something about the nature of reality. And there
Yes.
was almost nothing of that. And this is very common. The idea is that no, you should contextualize in a historical way, and that it sounds reasonable, etc., but very often it means very little. It means reading a bit of secondary literature, which often you can read by yourself. You don't need much instruction for,
Right. Exactly.
without being told that you should also be critical of that secondary literature. And this is very weird, because very often people are told that you should be critical basically of a tradition and its claims. But you're not really told the extent to which, well, why shouldn't I be critical of you, university lecturer, and your claims? Shouldn't I also check those? But
Yeah.
you're not given the instruments to do that. So to start from criticism, and in the sense of negative criticism, and present that as a form of critical thinking, I think is very problematic. And it undermines the enthusiasm of one's own endeavor to study something.
Yeah.
First understand, then criticize. Like the idea that you need to find flaws in order to understand something is dogmatic, actually.
Yeah. 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 I think I don't know whether that has something to do with maybe a modern misunderstanding of the Socratic method, right? And so, like dating all the way back to the ancient Greeks, right? You have the Western philosophical tradition as saying, look, it's all about a dialogue where you ask questions and then you poke and prod and,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
Does it have something to do with that, kind of, in a sense?
yes, but actually, now that's another interesting point, because this idea that there is this continuous Western philosophical tradition is it might be a fantasy.
Right.
Like
Right.
the idea that Bertrand Russell is a heir to Socrates.
Mm.
Really? I mean, would they have been happy with that? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah.
It looks like a complete. I mean, who are the heirs of Greeks in terms of philosophy is very hard to assess. If you look at even the way in which Greek philosophy reached back to Europe,
Mm.
and why that should be considered the privileged place for Greek culture or Greek philosophy is very problematic as well.
Mm.
So this is also a kind of fantasy that the Greeks were, even the pre-Socratic have been described as being already a type of scientific thinking, because they equated the elements with the deities. I've read things like this. So
Yes.
how is that scientific? It looks to me like something completely different.
Right. Right.
So, but this necessity of trying to portray Western culture as rationalist, as scientific, etc., it's a caricature. It's
Mm.
actually a caricature of the worst tendencies,
Yeah.
maybe, in European culture. It's not
Yes.
representative of European culture in its entirety.
Yeah.
And it just makes for this very strange boogeyman almost to scare others who want to do something different. So
Yeah.
it's not, if it is, I would suspect. Now, I don't read ancient um, Greek, so I cannot really speak with intelligence on that matter. But as you said, I would suspect that this is a caricature and a misunderstanding of the Socratic method as well.
Right. Yeah.
I really doubt that any ancient philosopher would have felt comfort with this level of negative engagement with something. I don't think it is. I cannot even imagine it maybe 200 years ago anywhere. Like, it's something for me very strange to have this kind of antagonism. Of course, as I said, it depends from, we're always talking of people. So it depends from person to person. There are degrees, there are nuances, etc. But
Yeah.
the institutional trend And the idea that that is going to make it scientific, that is where I feel there is a widespread problem, and it's not very easy to address. Oh, I see. There are questions from the audience. May I propose a very short break, and then we can have a look at the questions from the audience and then respond to it. Is that okay?
Yeah, please. I'll hold the fort, and our distinguished guest will, have a quick break. And Sumana Dhamma Wadinagala asks, how much do academic Buddhist teachings from different Buddhist schools help in understanding Buddhism, especially when learning from various teachers, each with their own idea? So if I understand the question correctly, you're talking about how different Buddhist schools might contribute to a broader overall understanding of Buddhism, like with kind of sort of like a cross fertilization or an ecumenical, like a sort of cross school kind of dialogue. Correct me if I've misunderstood that question. Excuse me. But I think while we're waiting for Mattia, I think it is critical to understand and seek to understand, academic Buddhist teachings from different schools. So, like in my personal life, I am a Chinese Buddhist. I'm a Pure Land Buddhist. I converted to Pure Land Buddhism, in 2008. But as I'm sure the Buddhist tradition is full of different Buddhist schools. Like you've got, Shingon in Japan. You've got the Theravada school, and within the Theravada school, you have so many diverse Nikayas and other bodies. So like Thai Buddhism is not Sri Lankan Buddhism, and even within Sri Lankan Buddhism, you will have many different Nikayas that have their own intellectual life and vigor. And so I, at least in principle, speaking not as an academic, I do think, getting acquainted with academic Buddhist teachings from these different schools is critical to understanding your own personal path in a broader sense, especially if you are open-minded about understanding your own place as a disciple of the three treasures. That is how I would understand it. And we'll have Mattia answer that question in a second. I think we've got a clip of Mattia to play, and we can do that anytime. Please go ahead.
Prasida Bhagavan. Prasida Bhagavan. Vilokayamana. Jadam Janamimam. Twadeka Sharanam. 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 Prasida Bhagavan. Vilokayamana. Jadam Janamimam Vadeka Sharanam Prasida Bhagavan Vilokayamana 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 Jadam Janamimam Vadeka Sharanam Vadeka Sharanam Vadeka Sharanam. Okay, surprising.
Hello.
Hello.
So we're back, and welcome back, Mattia.
Thank you.
I'm really enjoying our conversation tonight. And when we came back, when before you left, we had Sumana Dhamma Wadinakala. Yeah, this is his question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that maybe his question is referring to something not exactly academic. This is a little bit tricky because when we speak of academic Buddhist teachings from different Buddhist schools, if we are talking about Buddhist schools, they will have scholarly teachings, but not exactly academic. I don't know if this makes sense, because Buddhist school is a traditional term. So what one is going to do in, let's say, Theravada Vihara is scholarly, but I don't know if it is academic.
Right, exactly.
So this is where, of course, this is a bit tricky because the word academic also has a certain prestige. And I remember somebody writing almost derisively of traditional scholars, saying they're not scholars, they're scholiasts.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, scholar. Yeah.
So
right. Oh my gosh.
I don't want to suggest something along those lines, and it's also true that this line is constantly blurred because, taking for example the Theravada tradition, it's very obvious that what is now traditional teaching in that tradition has had a lot of influence from modern style European universities.
Yes, exactly.
So, and this is something that has happened quite a bit. It's also just due to the prestige that these universities had. So, but I think that the intent of the question is probably, how do I manage when I receive scholarly teachings or academic teachings, however we want to call them, that give me a different philosophy, a slightly different view of reality. What do I do with it? If each of them has completely their own ideas, then probably you shouldn't trust them too much, in the sense that if somebody is I don't know if a good representative is a good word, but if somebody is well trained in a specific school, what they say should not be completely incommensurable from what other people with a similar background, respected master from that school, are going to say. So there will be some degree of variation, but it's not going to be incommensurable. It's not going to be exactly entirely their own ideas. If you go to traditionally trained scholars from the Tibetan tradition, for example, you will find recurrent themes and very recognizable similar positions among many of the great scholars. That's one example.
Yeah.
So, but of course, I think Venerable refers also to his own situation of being in a modern academic setting where these two things tend to overlap, and where some modern scholars might have indeed very much their own ideas. Well, that's a difficult position. It's also, one also has to reflect carefully of what kind of relationship one is going to have with teachers that one meets in a classroom in a university. Because if you think of somebody as being your teacher in terms of a dharma, that is a more serious kind of relationship. That requires a certain level of commitment, and usually that is something that one does after that person has gained their trust to some extent. Now, if you are going to get a degree in a university, it is at least not guaranteed that all the lecturers that are going to appear in your classroom are people that you feel have something to offer in terms of being Buddhist practitioners. So in that case, I think one has to also see that and say that, okay, I can learn something from this person, but maybe not exactly regard this person in any way as a guide in my Buddhist practice. So one has to have that kind of mental flexibility. Of course, that is also probably true to some extent in a traditional setting, wherein one even uses different terms to indicate different levels of engagement with different teachers, and that is fine. But I think this difficulty is much more severe, so to speak, in a modern university, where indeed one of your lecturers might not be Buddhist at all, might even dislike Buddhism, but you might be getting classes from them. That is possible. So, of course, taking that as the guide towards how to practice Buddhism is not possible. But maybe that person is very good in explaining to you the difference between a conjecture and an emendation, and you can learn something valuable from that. So this is one needs, in this kind of very confused situation that we have now, in my opinion, we need to have a lot of mental flexibility but in the end, in fact, I'm sorry to say, the matter is extremely simple, because I'm really convinced that if somebody keeps a good intention, if one knows why I'm doing it, like, what do I want? What's my intention? Do I have the wish to get out of samsara? Or if I'm a Haina practitioner, do I have bodhicitta? If one goes back to that again and again and again, and reminds oneself of that every time one engages with a Buddhist text or a Buddhist class, etc., the danger of being led too much astray is very little. Because usually that danger appears when one starts thinking in a worldly way. So if one reduces that, one goes to a classroom without worldly concerns, then automatically I think one has a way to discern. One develops a kind of almost immediate discernment that there is something here that doesn't resonate with the Dharma, and it's still useful to learn this, but this is not the way for me to practice the Dharma. I'm not really going to follow it in that way. So if one is clear about one's intention, one is, today we had a class and I was emphasizing how crucial in Buddhist practice is vows. In fact, if one just takes care of that, one is clear about one's pratimoksha vows, one is clear about one's bodhicitta vows, all the rest should fall almost automatically in place. So vows is, if one takes vows not as a kind of preliminary ceremony, but rather as the foundation of one's practice, then I think one has very little to worry about. I see another question.
Yeah, this one's a great question. What is your opinion, Mattia, on traditional Buddhist studies that are present in several Buddhist countries like Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, and India, in Tibetan monasteries and colleges? Regarding the idea of practitioner scholar, would you consider those ancient Buddhist masters such as Buddhaghosa, Vasubandhu, Dhammakirti, and so on as models of a practitioner scholar? How would you look at Venerable Payutto, Buddhadasa, Nyanaponika, Nyanamoli, and Bhikkhu Bodhi's work? So
Okay.
this is a common question asked by people, I think, like this distinction. Yeah.
Well, yes, I would regard Buddhaghosa, Vasubandhu, and Dharmakirti as models of practitioner scholar. Yes, I think that actually that comes through in their own writing. And this is one of the beautiful things of being able to read in the original languages, because sometimes when Buddhist texts are translated into English, especially when it is texts which have a certain level of technicality, they become not that beautiful. Like they don't have, you don't feel like you're reading wonderfully classical, elegant prose like that of Vasubandhu, for example. So when you read Vasubandhu, the beauty of his Sanskrit is something that is deeply affecting.
Yep.
And I think you know that that doesn't come from nowhere, that there is something to someone being able to have that power in one's words. So for me, that immediately suggests this kind of idea of a practitioner scholar. Now, the other set that Venerable Sajjan Mig is mentioning is a different set, and I cannot say that much because I'm not very familiar with their work. I mean, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has done a lot of work of translation, which is astonishingly useful. I do not know very much, and that says a lot. I mean, of course, Venerable Payutto, I don't know that much. Venerable Buddhadasa, I do not know that much. Nyanaponika, Nyanamoli, yes, a little bit. And some things seem to be very useful. Yes, some of them could be close to that, but it's harder for me to say. It's easier if I read Vasubandhu or Buddhaghosa or Dharmakirti to have that kind of absolute confidence. This is really for me a model.
Yeah.
In terms of what people do nowadays, writing in English, etc., who is the model of a practitioner scholar? That's a bit tricky. It is difficult. Some have done things which are quite exceptional, even in English, I feel. And although some have reservations they feel is controversial, please leave that aside for a moment. But for me, one such example is Chogyen Trungpa. The Chogyen Trungpa Rinpoche, he was able definitely to transmit something in English in a way which is just astonishing. It is, even after several years now, it's rare to find someone who has that kind of power in one's words. And usually that is a sign of someone who is, yes, a practitioner scholar. So there's probably other examples as well. Now, the traditional Buddhist studies, the way it was it was present earlier on was probably different. I think there is also, and this is something that maybe now is too big of a topic to really delve into, but I think that there is also a crisis of support for traditional study of Buddhism in a monastic setting. There is a crisis of interest for monasticism, sadly, and so this is another issue altogether. That's why that probably is one of the reasons why modern day Buddhist monks also feel the need to go to modern universities. So if we are talking about centuries ago, you can see just what shines through this text is so much beyond anything that I see written in English in recent times, that I have to think, yes, that there was something really special about these masters that were able to read in this manner.
It's a big call though, like this idea of like I think it's a little bit different from saying if someone becomes a Muslim, a believer in Islam, they're encouraged to read Arabic, right? They're encouraged to learn Arabic so that they can read the Quran untranslated. It does sound like a bit of a tougher call on even a fairly smart, hard-working, like aspiring kind of like scholar of Buddhist studies who wants to engage with the tradition in good faith. That's just my kind of initial reflection. But there is also one more question that we probably should get to. The audience question is more important. For me, I tend to have a yes, no, right, or wrong answer, which I know is a weakness. It seems to me that to have I don't know as an answer is often looked down upon by many.
Yeah.
Could this be one of the causes of the antagonistic approach which you have mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is the case. The idea that we do not know certain things about the past, even about the nature of the past, like what is the past? Can we really have a uniform perception of the past, etc.? That is something that many scholars are going to be rather uncomfortable with. They're more comfortable projecting confidence about what they're going to say about the past. Because otherwise, the idea is we're not going to understand anything about Buddhism. And I think this is a very un-Buddhist premise. Like the idea that you need to learn the whole of history in order to understand Buddhism. Most Buddhists would disagree with that because it presupposes that your understanding of the past is not predicated upon your understanding of the present. And this premise is weird, actually. It's a little bit weird. Like if how can the way I relate to this room in this moment have nothing to do with the way I conceptualize something that happened 1,000 years ago? And if this part itself is not very reliable, shouldn't I take better care of it first? And then slowly walk my way through 1,000 years in the past, or 2,000 years in the past, or 2 million years in the past. So this actually being able to say, okay, there's some things I do not know for sure at the moment. I'm comfortable with a certain level of uncertainty to begin with. I see certain things as being more plausible and I go for it. Fine. Now, Raymond, one thing you were saying, I think, was about language. I would like to say that this also is a prejudice that many people have. They think, oh, learning Pali or learning Sanskrit is going to be so difficult. It is not. It depends from the level of engagement. Like someone can study a certain level of Pali or Sanskrit and use it to understand a little bit. It doesn't mean that necessarily one becomes a philologist in either of these two languages, but just a certain level of engagement is different from zero. And even if one is reading quite a bit through translations in English, but to have some glimpses of the original language, to understand a little bit what is the logic of these original languages, it really gives immediately a different perspective, even when then you read something in English. If you know how sentences work in Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, or Tibetan, then you also see through a little bit the English translations. You understand what kind of flavor they're trying to convey, and maybe you read that flavor into the English translation as well a little bit better. So it's not a black and white situation in that case. Like, and this is another example of being uncomfortable with I don't know. When people learn languages, they feel I'm not going to do it because I'm never going to be fluent. But that's not the point. You don't start learning something only when you have a certainty of mastery. Especially if you believe in multiple lifetimes, it is worth starting engaging with at least one Buddhist language. I think even for a very average Buddhist practitioner, it's a matter of spending 5 minutes a day. It doesn't. If one has enough time to spend brushing one's teeth, shouldn't one have enough time to learn one of the Buddhist languages? And it's really a matter of a few minutes a day. So these are, in a way, related issues, because it's also true that some feel if I read this bunch of secondary literature books on Buddhist history, I know about Buddhism. I don't need to make this effort to learn the original languages and really delve into the tradition. I have the bird's eye view, this kind of delusional concept. And they're comfortable. They feel, I already know what Buddhism is. Now, then if I start reading the languages, they are immediately confronted by the fact that there are some things they don't know. They are confronted with the very simple point that they don't have even the tools to evaluate whether the histories they've been taught are based on anything. They could be completely invented. They actually have no tools to decide this book on Buddhist history is based on convincing reasoning, based on some evidence. If you don't read Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, how are you going to evaluate that? It could be all invented. So it is quite interesting that people want to be reassured, maybe, that they know something, that they're educated people, they have read lots of books, all in English, with no way to assess the reliability of the method through which these hypotheses were formulated. So isn't it better to spend a few minutes a day learning a bit of Sanskrit, learning a bit of Pali or Chinese or Tibetan, and slowly feel closer to the tradition in some ways? Of course, it's not just the language. I'm not saying that. One should try to practice as much as possible in the most formal, traditional way one can imagine. But why not make that small effort? Because you were making the comparison with Islam, and interestingly, I happen sometimes to have taught students from Indonesia,
right?
and
Yeah.
some of them knew some of the Quran by heart, no problem. In Tamil Nadu, I met auto rickshaws driver who could recite quite a bit of a Tirukkural, which is in Tamil, but it's classical Tamil, so it's not like the. And this is common in many cultures, but in the especially English-speaking Buddhist community, there is a certain laziness about, now I'm going to chant in Pali or Tibetan or Sanskrit or Chinese and slowly try to understand what I'm chanting. If someone is chanting an important text, like let's say the Heart Sutra, every day for many years, one could at least make an effort to learn the meaning word by word. It's not
Yes.
is not a lot of words for a lifetime.
Yeah.
And one could make at least that effort. Or the words that one says when taking refuge, at least learn what does the word Buddha mean, what does Dharma mean, what does Sangha mean,
Yeah.
what does Sharana mean. It's just a handful of words, but they define one's vows. So why not that small effort is not a huge effort.
You start from there, right? Because it's actually so simple, right? Buddham, Sharanam, Gacchami, and it's
Exactly.
like, and then you just expand the repertoire.
Exactly. I mean, with any language, the main point is exposure. Sanskrit is not difficult, it's just that people have less exposure to it. English is not easy, it's just that we have exposure to English whether we want it or not. So it makes it easier to acquire it. But there are ways in which we can make a small effort and be exposed to these Buddhist languages, especially to get a sense of their incredible beauty. Like the fact that they have so much to offer in terms of how elegant, precise, powerful they are. And that means they have a strong effect on our minds as well.
Yeah.
And to an extent that makes us think sometimes, at least to me, that we really lost certain abilities. We really lost a certain way of perceiving things, since we are not able to communicate in that way anymore for the most. So this is something that I feel any Buddhist practitioner nowadays could make an effort towards, because anyhow we engage with texts all the time. Small text, some text. We always read some kind of text throughout our day on our phone. So why not engage with a text which is wholesome, which puts something really beyond our worldly thoughts in our mind stream, and helps us to connect more genuinely to the Buddhist tradition. So that's an area that I think modern Buddhist studies should emphasize. That was my point about language. Language studies should be the backbone of academic Buddhist studies, partly because it also creates a natural interface with the tradition, and it can help Buddhist practitioners feel closer to Buddhism. So that is what I would really encourage any university to emphasize. Of course, language studies is not divorced from the study of content. When you teach language, especially, let's say you're teaching Pali or Sanskrit in the context of Buddhism, you introduce terms, you discuss their meaning in a Buddhist context, etc. This way, those who learn will start feeling almost immediately that it is useful, that it is something at least that is connected to their aspirations as Buddhist practitioners. So in this way, the interface with the Buddhist community and with traditional concerns, traditional Buddhist concerns, is somewhat natural, not very forced. And even someone who is not maybe a Buddhist practitioner, but they might be good in a Buddhist language, they can contribute something and even help Buddhist practitioners in that sense. So, that was a long reply to Ram's question, but I hope it addressed it in full, so to speak.
I think that is a very inspiring and very, and it's just true. I mean, like, it's like asking an Englishman if it's sufficient to read Shakespeare in French or something like that, right? Like, of course, you would want to engage with. Yeah, exactly.
The difference is quite big.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's why I also wanted to shout out one of my preceptors, Venerable K.L. Dhammajotti. He is the director and founder of the Buddha Dharma Center in Hong Kong, and his program of Buddhist studies, as you pointed out, Mattia, puts language studies as the backbone of understanding, because you cannot understand someone if you don't speak their language, right? Like you have
Yeah.
to have some common, not linguistic, sorry, that was the incorrect word, but you have to have some common ground of communication. And if you want to understand those ancient sutras and shastras and so on, there has to be some engagement with the words.
Yes, there is one term which is used to explain the audience of poetry, especially in Sanskrit.
Right.
And there are some poets who say that the worst thing that can happen to you is to recite your poetry in front of somebody who is not a sahradaya. So the audience, sahradaya, means someone who has your same heart.
Oh
So
no, yeah, exactly, yeah.
the audience, the audience of poetic recitation, of literature, is also an audience that cultivates the ability to appreciate poetry, and therefore is immediately deeply affected when there is a very beautiful verse, when something is expressed very powerfully. And that's the kind, okay, now we can resuscitate the word empathy. That's a kind of very deep empathy towards the text that one should try to develop. Incidentally, this idea, okay, this is not specifically Buddhist. This field of Sanskrit poetry is kind of common to all the religions that express themselves through Sanskrit. And I found there is a very similar idea. I must thank Professor Curie Virac for sharing one of her articles on a Neo-Confucian master who actually made very similar points regarding how you read texts. And one point is this kind of very strongly empathetic engagement where you are trying to live the text. And he also speaks in terms of flavor. You get the flavor of the text, which is what is used in Indian aesthetics to describe any aesthetic experience which is really high. Then that experience is called rasa. Is you
Rasa.
experience a kind of flavor, but this is a very high type of aesthetic experience. And this is also brought up to describe the speech of a Buddha, for example, which gives a kind of very exceptional flavor, a kind of exceptional joy in the listeners. So this is something that it's never an aseptic type of reading that one does with the Buddhist text. It's something one chants them, and they're supposed to affect oneself very deeply. Now, the idea that this would impede a fair analysis is just stupid. There is no connection between the two things.
Yes.
Because there is a fallacy there. The idea that somehow one's emotional content a priori precludes the ability to reason sharply. It's just not like that. There is no connection between the two things.
It's a heavily flawed assumption, yeah.
At the very least, it's unproven.
Yeah.
It's impossible to establish a necessary concomitance between these two things. So, in fact, one could suspect the opposite, that this attempt at complete neutrality is a form of self-deception, and it often results in aversion, actually. One could actually, because it is based on a fundamental lack of human empathy. Even if one believes that texts have been composed by authors, like when we start a conversation with someone, even if we don't know the person, we start with the assumption that they speak to us in good faith.
Yes.
To some extent, unless we have good reason to completely mistrust the person, we try to encounter another person with a certain level of openness and actually listen, not talk over them. Maybe that's what I've been doing with you, but
No, this is fantastic. No, but it's like the equivalent of shouting over the text. If what you mean, if it's like kind of like an analogy, right?
exactly. And this is actually, I feel, a little bit the flaw of a lot of modern academic writing on Buddhism, that it imposes completely alien concerns without first trying to actually understand the concerns of the text. Remarkably, there were scholars who were not Buddhist 100 years ago or so who did a much better job to really make an effort and understand what the Buddhist texts want to express in their own terms. A good example, I think, is Delavalle Poussin. If you take Delavalle Poussin's work, I think he was a priest, in fact, a Catholic priest.
Yeah, he was a Catholic priest, a Belgian priest. Yeah, very, very famous about that.
So you take his work, we can still use it.
Yes.
I mean, he actually annotated the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya at a time where there was no electronic material. He could not do searches, but you see the amount of work he did. So you can see already, definitely he had some kind of reverence for this text, respect for this text, and he wanted to show in a positive light what this text is saying. He might disagree with it, but disagreement doesn't always mean lack of reverence. This is a really terrible.
This is really important. Yeah.
You can't disagree with something but see that it has extremely good points.
Yeah.
Like one example is, in some Buddhist traditions, it is said one should develop a positive view of other religions and philosophies because they were taught by bodhisattvas for those who are not ready to actually digest the doctrine of selflessness.
Yes.
But that means that you should gain an appreciation of the really positive sides of those philosophies. So the fact that you might have a certain level of disagreement doesn't mean you don't revere them. Of course, this applies even more in the Buddhist tradition.
Exactly.
If someone, let's say, is a Yogacara philosopher, it doesn't mean they are going to look down on Vaibhashika. You see, they might actually do prostrations to Vaibhashika masters.
Yeah.
So disagreement and lack of reverence should not go together. There are cases of guru and shishya, teacher and disciple, even very close, but philosophically having some disagreement, and that was completely okay. So this is also a point that we are lacking. We seem to have lost the ability to disagree while having a completely positive view of the other person.
Oh, that was lost long ago. I mean, like this is like this is a worldwide problem, and like in future streams, in future episodes, I don't know if we might end up talking about like the broader epistemic sort of fracture of the current global environment. But there is definitely something in the idea that, oh, you disagree with me, and therefore that ruptures, that destroys somehow our relationship. Like that it is no longer possible to even relate on any kind of level if you disagree with my perspective.
Yeah, that is well. There's two things come to mind which I think are very beautiful. One is I think it's in the Abhidharma Samuccaya Bhashya, but anyway, the Yogacara text, where I believe it is said what kind of mindset you should have when you go for a debate. how should you relate to the other people? And the answer is Maitri.
Maitri, yes.
So you should have the heartfelt wish for them to be happy, like you would have towards your only child. That's basically how you should debate with a person. And another one is, one should never, this from Dharmakirti, earlier we mentioned Dharmakirti, one should not enter a debate with a wish to win.
Yeah, interesting.
The purpose of a debate is the wish to know reality. So it doesn't matter who wins or loses. The point is, will we understand reality better? That is actually Dharmakirti is saying it is wrong if you enter a debate with a wish to win. So that kind of attitude makes even the way in which one is going to have a discussion, a debate, completely different. And also the way in which one looks at different religions, it's totally different if one starts from that kind of mindset. And I think we might not be able to immediately fix the whole world, but at least as Buddhists, also engaged with, let's say, academic study of Buddhism, which requires a certain amount of debate as well.
Yes.
Even with people who have very negative views about Buddhist masters, etc. To be reminded of that is also a way not to be sucked into that. Because actually, I think if we have more of an aversion, like when somebody is very negative towards the Buddhist tradition, it is affecting our mind more. And actually, we might end up doing the same thing to prove that we are part of a club. But if we have a very positive view of that person, even at their worst, then they don't affect us much.
Yeah.
And so, actually, to apply the very principles that the Buddhist masters have laid out on how to engage in debate, etc., I think that is the way forward for those who want to stay within an academic setting and yet be unapologetically, very clearly Buddhist practitioners. We do have these instruments. We should also be conversant with them and have faith in them. Like this, it might have been written long ago, but really these were great Buddhist masters. We should gain that kind of conviction and use what they have had to offer and see how it really affects us. Even we are in a conference where everyone hates our favorite Buddhist master.
we hate our subject matter.
But we can still, that is an amazing occasion actually as a Buddhist practitioner in a way to see, okay, am I really a Buddhist practitioner, or is my mind completely destroyed by being in this situation? Am I completely taken away? Am I going to start saying bad things about Buddhism just to fit in? It's something we can see very clearly.
Yeah. I think that's a sobering thought, but at the same time, you've described a path that can navigate that perilous road. And it is perilous because the temptation can always be there, and even subconsciously, if you're immersed in that, like that environment, and they've got the fancy degrees, and they've got the comfortable air-conditioned rooms, and you've got the nice offices. Yeah, I absolutely understand what you're saying, and I think, quite frankly, like this is, we've touched on some very, very fundamental questions as to what even Buddhist studies is, and I think we've gone beyond like the typical discussion about like recent developments in Buddhist studies or anything like that. In some ways, that is not really, that's kind of like superficial talk. So I really, I really appreciate the time that you've taken to join me on this live stream. the question and the answers that you've so generously given to our Q&A. I think thank you so much, Mattia. I think maybe in a future stream episode, we might touch upon further discussion points in Buddhist studies, and possibly go even further when it comes to talking about like divisions and enmity with those that disagree with us. I think that's a separate subject altogether. It would be very interesting to discuss the current situation of the world from a Buddhist perspective, from a Buddhist lens. But for now, I think we are reaching 1 hour 45 minutes, and I think we'll call it a night for this live stream. And thank you so much all for joining me, and I'll be back next week with another episode, with another live stream as your host, and look forward to seeing you. Please ask questions if you feel like it for on the stream. We're doing a very relaxed kind of format, just a conversation like we've done tonight here. So thank you so much, and a good night, a good morning, and a good afternoon to everyone. And thank you most of all to Mattia for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody. Bye-bye.